In class this week, we spent part of our time reviewing labor markets, markets with monopsonies, markets with labor unions. We did not have a free response question this week because of the canceled class on Tuesday. We will have a free response question on monopsony at the beginning of class next week. So the remainder of the time this week, we focused on the markets for other resources and how other resources are allocated, primarily land, capital, and entrepreneurship. So firms will demand more of each resource as long as it's efficient to do so when the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost. We have already looked a little bit at least cost use of resources, looking at the combinations, marginal product of labor divided by the price of labor, comparing that to the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital. But we're going to look a little more into those issues today. So first we'll look at land. Land is a little bit unusual. Unlike labor, the supply of land is in some cases by economists considered to be fixed. And here primarily we are talking about actual land property. We're not talking about everything else in the category of land because other items like animals and trees, for example, we can certainly produce more of. However, land on the planet Earth is relatively fixed. More can't be created even in response to higher prices. If you look at this top graph, you will see that the demand for land varies based on the quality of the land. For example, D1 might be very arable land. It could be land in downtown New York, on Manhattan. It could be land in San Francisco. There's a lot of demand for land there. So land there gets a very high price, or what we call a very high rent. If you're the owner of that land, you can charge a very high rent for other people to use that land. D3 might be barren land, land without oil, for example, in North Dakota or Nevada somewhere. So here, there's very low demand, and in fact, nobody would actually pay rent to be using that land. So the demand for land is what dictates the rent. Rent can be an explicit or implicit cost for a firm. It is an explicit cost if you have to pay rent for the use of someone else's land. It's an implicit cost if you are the owner of the land and you need to think about alternate uses, who would be willing to pay you if you were not using it for your own use. Rents allocate land because land will be used by whoever is willing to pay the most for it. In other words, whoever can get the most productivity out of it. So if you consider a piece of land, for example, in Manhattan, which has a very high rent, that land is very unlikely to be used as farmland because a farmer would be very unlikely to be able to get as much productivity out of it as, for example, a banker who could build a building there and house bankers and be close to Wall Street. So the land would be allocated to the banker rather than the farmer because the banker would be willing to pay more for it because the banker would have a higher income using that land. If we consider varied uses, then we would look at a slightly different supply curve. We'll look here. If we think of land as land for a specific use, for example, land for residential development, what you see is that the supply of land available for residential development increases as the price goes up. The more someone who's a builder is willing to pay per acre, the more farmland suddenly becomes available, which is why so much of the farmland in the metropolitan Twin Cities area has been converted into housing in the last 20 years. If you're a farmer with 600 acres and someone comes to you and says, I'm willing to offer you $5 million for your property, you're pretty likely to consider taking the money and perhaps retiring to Florida rather than continuing to farm. What would happen to supply if farm profits declined? Think about this for a moment. What would be likely to happen to the supply curve itself if suddenly farming became less profitable? The answer is that the supply curve would shift to the right, that at all prices, the comparisons of the productivity and the profits to be had would move toward the residential development and away from farms. Rents, as we said, are a payment for the use of land. But because land and the ownership of land is such a sort of historical accident, and because the right to land essentially has to be protected by the government in terms of property rights, the term rent seeking has taken on kind of a negative connotation. So rent is considered, as it says here, a surplus payment because whoever owns the land didn't invent it or create it. It's not like labor, where what you do with your own physical body in terms of labor, that is clearly yours. Entrepreneurship, your ideas are yours. Capital is something that is built by people. So all of those things really belong to the person who is behind them, whereas land it typically belongs to someone perhaps because of inheritance, perhaps because of historical accident, because the government laid out a specific way for property rights to be established, and whoever initially bought it and therefore then sold it and profited off it got it because of some attribute being in the right place at the right time. You're going to read this week about a proposal to have a single tax on land where all rents would be taxed away and there would be no sales tax or income tax. So you can think about that. But because rent is a fairly controversial way of actually earning money, anytime people find ways to get the government to give them special treatment in a way that enhances their personal wealth, we actually call that rent-seeking behavior. So if you see or hear the term rent-seeking, it doesn't just mean owning property in the hopes that you'll get a rent, but it could mean, for example, a firm supporting a political candidate knowing that they will then get a tax break, or the Disney Corporation lobbying Congress to allow them to extend their copyrights on their movies and music, which allows them to get a lot more profits. That again is rent-seeking, getting the government to do something that allows you to continue to make profits. The Vikings getting the state to build them a new stadium is also rent-seeking. Rent-seeking is not considered allocatively efficient. It's not the same as competing for profit in a free market. All right, we're going to move on to capital. Capital, when we've talked about it before, is generally we are talking about physical capital. Okay, physical capital is the machinery, tools, and technology that allow you to increase your production. If you think about a firm having an ATC curve, okay, in the short run, if they expand their capital, they would get a new ATC curve. Okay, each time they expand, unless of course they encounter diseconomies of scale. But their long run ATC curve shows that with more capital, right, they can be more efficient, they can produce more output. So firms are investing in physical capital to allow them to produce more. When they decide to make the decision to invest, they have to compare the rate of return on the investment. In other words, how much will we profit by this investment? And they compare that to the cost of the investment. Okay, what is the cost of the investment? Essentially, it's the cost of borrowing money to make the investment, which is why this term, financial capital, becomes important. Although money is not a resource, money is part of what's needed in order to be able to buy physical capital. Firms have to hire financial capital in order to buy physical capital. So if you look at this farmer, Farmer John, he's deciding whether to buy a new $200,000 tractor. He is going to compare two things: the rate of return, how much money he'll make off this tractor, to the cost of borrowing the money to buy the tractor. So let's say he knows that if he buys the tractor, it will improve his crop output by $10,000 a year. That is a 5% return on his investment. It costs him $8,000 a year, or a rate of 4%, to borrow the money to buy the tractor. So, should he buy the tractor? Yes, because his rate of return, 5%, is greater than the 4% for the money he has to borrow. Okay, if the interest rates go up, let's say suddenly the interest rate is now 6%, then no, this is not a worthwhile investment. Somebody else should be borrowing the money, somebody who could get more than a 6% rate of return. Finally, what if he has the money? The answer is it doesn't matter, because then we have to consider the prevalent interest rate in the market as an opportunity cost for him. If he has $200,000 sitting around, certainly buying a tractor is not the only thing he could do with it. So now he needs to weigh the rate of return of the tractor against, for example, buying a certificate of deposit or possibly investing in the stock market. Oftentimes, when we get to this discussing interest rates, discussing what TCF would offer him or the opportunity cost of money, students get confused about what interest rate are we talking about. And so very briefly, I want to note that there is no single interest rate, that interest rates are actually a family of interest rates that include the federal funds rate, and some of these terms we're really going to talk about in macro. So if you're taking macro, we'll focus on these a lot more. The federal funds rate, the discount rate, the mortgage rate, which is whatever the rate is to buy a house, car loan rates, credit card rates, okay, all of these different interest rates are related, and they tend to rise and fall together. Economists use this idea of a loanable funds theory of interest to explain why interest rates are the way they are. Okay, and the loanable funds theory of interest compares the supply of all loanable funds, in other words, all of the savings that is available out there, everybody who has a savings account, from a small child to a grandmother to the 3M Corporation saving profits perhaps in a bank. Compares that to the demand for loanable funds, which is everyone who wants to borrow. That includes all consumers, people who want to buy boats and houses and cars, and people who want to borrow to go to college. And it also includes business firms who are looking to expand. So the supply and demand of loanable funds will determine this hypothetical underlying pure interest rate. Whatever that interest rate is, let's say right now that interest rate is about 0.5%. Okay? All other interest rates will rise and fall with that. So if that rate is 0.5%, mortgage interest rates might be 3.5%. Okay? If this pure interest rate increases because the demand for loans increases, let's say that goes up to 2%, then home mortgage rates are also going to go up to, say, 5%. So interest rates change on a pretty regular basis, and firms need to be comparing their rates of return on capital to the current market interest rates. This graph also will be used a lot in macro, where we look at how firms decide whether to invest. If you look at this, what it is doing is it's looking at the interest rate, right, compared to the quantity of investment. And as you can see, the higher the interest rate is, the less money, okay, the less capital will actually be allocated into business firm investment. When interest rates get low, there will be a lot more allocation because there will be a lot more investments that have a rate of return that would be higher than the interest rate. We're going to skip over the nominal versus real right now and just very quickly touch on entrepreneurship. Fortunately, earlier in the semester, we actually talked about the payment to entrepreneurship, which is profit. And if you recall, way back from Unit 2, we talked about two kinds of profit, normal and economic profit. Normal profit is one of the implicit costs of production. It's the minimum amount an entrepreneur needs to be paid in order to actually stay with the firm. It's how much did Bill Gates need to actually earn in order for him to keep his talents at Microsoft instead of going elsewhere? How much did Steve Jobs need at Apple? Economic profit occurs when there is actually that profit above and beyond, right? Normal profit, when total revenues actually exceed total costs. And of course, economic profits don't last in perfect competition, but in other market structures, they might exist. This payment also goes to the entrepreneur, and this we consider their payment for taking the risks of entrepreneurship, because they are the ones who take that risk. So if you think about it, the profit also allocates the resource of entrepreneurship, because the most profitable industries are going to lure the most entrepreneurs. Right now, many young entrepreneurs see the most profitable, potentially profitable industry as being the computer industry, and so they're drawn to Silicon Valley. They want to get engineering degrees and business degrees, and they want to start up new firms, new online services like Snapchat or Instagram. They consider it worth the risks because there are very high profits to be made there. If those profits started dropping and there didn't seem to be much more of a market, then entrepreneurs would more likely take their talents into different industries. So to summarize, as we talked about, wages are going to allocate labor, right? People are going to go work in whatever industry is going to pay them the most, assuming that they have the skills and education necessary. Rents are going to allocate land to its most profitable use. Interest is going to allocate capital, because firms are only going to buy capital if their rate of return is going to exceed the interest rate. And profit is going to allocate entrepreneurship.